Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery for another episode of Monk Chat. This is Ayasoma, and to my left is Bhakti Sutaso, and to my right, Ayavata. And we're here ready to answer any questions that you might have about Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So whenever you're ready, feel free to type in your questions, and we'll try our best to answer them. So I don't know if the Venerables want to share a few reflections of how the Vasa is going for you all.
Maybe we can start with Namo Tassa.
Okay.
And then let's see where it goes from there.
Sounds good.
Namo Tassa
Bhagavato
Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddham Dhammam Sangham Namasami.
So welcome to Bhumika, Yankee, Sud, Karuna, Monastic Cuddler, best nickname ever. And hello to Shadow Label, who says, I and Bante are back. Yes, we are indeed. And hello to Rick, Wiseman, Vivian, Jayanta, hello, and Rupal as well. And Shadow Label has a question. So do people have a choice to be reincarnated into different timelines?
Well, first off, you're starting with the premise that there are, in fact, different timelines. So that's something that you'll need to explain what exactly you mean by different timelines before we can talk about whether it's possible or not. Reincarnated, we don't normally use the term reincarnation in Buddhism. We normally use the term rebirth. So we actually just, if you ask, can a person be reincarnated? The answer is no, but there is the rebirth process. So we could talk about the rebirth process. But does there seem to be an element of volition in the rebirth process? The answer is yes. So a clear example of this is given in the Sankharupapati Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha speaks about how the intention that one forms for one's next life does have an effect. It's not the sole deciding factor. The primary deciding factor is, of course, one's karma. But the intention or desire to have a particular rebirth can shape the direction that one's next life takes. It can affect where one is reborn.
There's also a follow-up that maybe Bhante want to address. Can a person be rebirthed into any time in the past or future?
There is no support in the suttas for being reborn in the past. As far as I know, all of the evidence from the suttas is that rebirth occurs in the future. So there does seem to be support for at least a subjective experience of linear time in the suttas. Whether linear time is actually real or just an illusion of a unawakened mind is another question, but that does seem to be how the suttas talk about it.
Excellent.
Mary?
Good to see you, Mary and Julie. And Wiseman asks, I'm new to Buddhism and would like to know how one becomes a Buddhist. Also, where and how does one start? I'm greatly intrigued yet overwhelmed at how complex Buddhism is. Venerable Banda, do you want to answer this?
Sure. Well, welcome to the world of Buddhism. And I'm sure we're all very happy that you're interested in becoming a Buddhist and exploring Buddhism. So I guess the first thing I would say is that you're overwhelmed at how complex Buddhism is. And I would say you don't need to be overwhelmed because it's actually quite simple, that we just give up cultivating things that are unbeneficial and create suffering. We take on things that are beneficial to our lives, and we cultivate our mind. So that's the teaching of all the Buddhas. So it can be quite simple. It can be a little bit complex too, depending on how you look at it, but nothing to be overwhelmed about. And as for how one becomes a Buddhist, usually the way that this is understood is that one is a Buddhist when one takes the 3 refuges in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and also usually one at least has an aspiration of following the 5 precepts. So there's a little bit of flexibility here in terms of, what exactly is the strictness, but usually if someone is intentionally breaking the 5 precepts, so they're aware of these precepts and they intentionally break them, and they don't take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, then usually that person, even if they say they're a Buddhist, they probably doesn't have much significance in terms of what that actually means. So taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha means that you look for refuge, you look for safety, you look for guidance in your life in the teachings of the Buddha, which is the Dhamma, and in the way that things are, which is also, so the Buddha taught the Dhamma to describe how things work. So in terms of causality and conditionality especially. So when I do this, this is the result. I'm not going to go against that. So I'm going to take refuge in what the Buddha has taught about how things work. And you take refuge in the Buddha himself and in the quality of awakening. And you take refuge in the Sangha, which is the community of Buddhist people who have learned from the Buddha, his disciples. So especially the monastic Sangha, the Bhikkhu Sangha, which would be monastics who are bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, who take on the form of that the Buddha designed for liberation. And also what's called the Savaka Sangha, so the community of disciples, which includes lay people who are following the Buddha's instructions and realize the different stages of awakening that the Buddha taught. So I would say if you go to refuge in the Buddha, you go to refuge in his teachings, and you go to refuge in his community. So you look for support and understanding in the monastics and in the lay people who have followed and understood the Buddha's teachings. And you take, you have some intentionality around following the 5 precepts. So you don't intentionally kill living beings. You don't intentionally take things that you shouldn't take, that don't belong to you, that aren't yours. You don't commit sexual misconduct. So, for instance, cheating on your partner when it's against their consent. So doing things sexually that would be harmful to other people. You don't lie. You don't intentionally deceive and lie to people. And you don't intentionally intoxicate the mind, especially with alcohol or alcoholic drinks and beverages or any kind of drug that is just intoxicating and weakens your self-restraint, weakens your mindfulness and awareness. So those are the basics of the 5 precepts. And not every person who would identify as a Buddhist is constantly following these 5 precepts, right? Maybe they drink alcohol on the weekends or they have some alcohol. But the Buddha gave these 5 precepts as what lay people and everyone who follows his teaching should strive to follow. So I would say part of taking refuge in the Dhamma is taking refuge in the fact that these precepts protect one. They bring happiness in this life and they bring happiness in the next life. So if you try to search for happiness by killing sentient beings, you're probably not really taking refuge in the Dhamma. You might be taking refuge in a Dhamma, so not Dhamma. So ideally, someone who's a Buddhist would strive to, when they look for happiness, when they look for safety, when they look for guidance, they look to the Buddhist teachings, which the most essential of which is the 5 precepts for living a good life. And where and how does one start? Well, you can start in your mind right now. You can look at the 5 precepts, review them, make an intention, and say, okay, the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, I go to refuge to the Buddha, to the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and make that intention. And then you could also seek out a monastic, preferably a monastic community like a monastery near you, and you can just request to them, I'd like to take the 3 refuges and 5 precepts. And they'll happily, almost always, if they're available, the monastics will work with you to find a time to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Venerable.
There's actually a bit more information from Shadow of Label, which I think
Yes.
clarifies their question a bit better.
Shadow of Label is saying, okay, cool. I only question because I watch Marvel Universe, multi-universe theory, and if it can be applied in Buddhism with reincarnation.
Well, first off, I would recommend using a bit of caution when using fictional superhero stories in studying Buddhist theory, because actual overlap might be quite minimal. That said, the multi-universe theory, the concept that there are multiple universes concurrently existing, this is something which is nothing new to Marvel. It's been something that has been theorized about actually since before the time of the Buddha. And Buddhism does seem to be in line with the multiple universes model. So the idea that there are multiple universes, potentially countless universes concurrently existing, does seem to fit perfectly within the Buddhist framework. But this is a very different question from your earlier one about timelines. So the existence of parallel universes does not have anything whatsoever to do with time travel or with rebirth in the past or the future. But potentially being reborn in a different universe, yeah, that does seem to be possible within the Buddhist framework.
Excellent, thank you, Bante. And Rick asks, what are skillful means when feeling overwhelmed by multiple days of life-altering pain? Thank you. Well, first and foremost, if you're experiencing pain, I'm really sorry to hear that. So we'll send you a lot of blessings, or whoever is experiencing this, you're in our hearts, and we'll keep you in mind. And yeah, for whoever, if it's you, Rick, I'll speak to you. Imagining that this is perhaps something that you have been going through lately, my recommendation is to be really gentle with yourself. Sometimes when we're Buddhist practitioners, we can tend to be a little bit hard on ourselves, especially when we're going through a lot of physical and actually also emotional distress. We kind of can be a little bit harder than the average person on ourselves, and start thinking that we're not a good Buddhist, and that we are supposed to, be having a different experience or a different reaction, or just we should be somewhere else, but instead maybe we're just a big jumble of mess. And that's okay. And so that's why I feel like the Buddha taught not 2 noble truths, not 3 noble truths, but 4 noble truths. And the first noble truth, which is a noble truth in and of itself, is the truth of suffering, is the truth of dukkha. So when we're actually experiencing dukkha, we shouldn't be running to the 3rd noble truth, the end of suffering, or the 4th one, but actually really understand what suffering is. How does it manifest in our experience, and learn from it. And also at the same time, kind of give us a bit of an embrace and a hug, and go like, yeah, this is really difficult. This is dukkha. This is difficult to bear. That's exactly the definition of dukkha. Something difficult to bear. If it was easy to bear, then we wouldn't need the teachings of the Buddha. We wouldn't be here practicing. It would be very easy to bear. We would just go around. So it's just part of the process of being unenlightened, and the process of learning the Dhamma, and the process of then practicing the Dhamma. But the practice of Dhamma comes from also the learning of, it's also practicing the Dhamma when we're actually observing dukkha, when we're understanding how dukkha comes into being. And just being gentle with yourself, and trying to do acts of loving kindness towards yourself, taking care of yourself, sleeping in a little bit, maybe, if it's difficult. Just not trying to outperform, overperform, but rather go, well, right now the body doesn't feel too good, so I just need to relax a little bit. Actually, also the Buddha, an enlightened being, would take sometimes some naps, and would also lay down when he was close to the end of his life also, and he had a very old body, and so obviously he wasn't undergoing mental suffering, but still the body, there were unpleasant sensations, right? So he was also being pretty gentle with himself, an enlightened being. So I think we can actually take a few cues from that and understand that on top of that, we're unenlightened, we're not even the Buddha, so it will be a lot more difficult. And I feel like that actually is a nice act of karma, where we are actually gentle with ourselves. We are making acts of loving kindness, and we are understanding a little bit more suffering. And then once that will subside, so we also remember that, this state that we're in, that's also the good news of anicca. Everything is impermanent. So even dukkha is impermanent. So even all these awful bodily sensations are impermanent. They're not there all the time. They're not constantly there. So we don't necessarily have to just look forward to when they're subsiding, but we can keep them in mind. So we can try to develop equanimity to the fact that maybe they were always going to be present. So we can keep that as an exercise of going, I won't be averse to these bodily feelings, but also remembering that those two shall change. Those two will subside at a certain point, and maybe they'll appear again. But it's something that is independent from, it's an impersonal process. It's not something that we can control or that we have, that belongs to us. So we can take it as an opportunity to learn. I don't know if the other venerables have any other thoughts. And Hai Ang says, how can a pilgrimage to Buddha holy places like Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Kushinara, Deer Park, Vulture Peak develop our faith in the Buddha Dhamma and guide us to develop spiritual awareness in our practice? How should one conduct our behavior, thoughts, speech, bodily actions during the pilgrimage to attain a fruitful pilgrimage? Well, 3 steps, 1 vow, meditation at the holy places, chanting can help us attain jhanas during pilgrimage. Mate?
Well, first off, as far as developing your faith, I mean, if you're thinking about doing a pilgrimage to the holy sites, it sounds like you already have faith. So I think it would more be while you're in those places, then reminding yourself that this is where the Buddha walked. It's where the great Arhat monks from the time of the Buddha lived and practiced. So you can go to places where the great enlightened bhikkhus and bhikkhunis from the Buddha were living. So reminding yourself that that's what was going on. This is where it all started. As for your behavior, so then try to act with compassion and self-restraint. So keeping metta and karuna, being very careful not to act from greed or hatred during the time. So really doing your best to keep pure conduct, to act as much like an awakened being as possible. As for 3 steps, 1 vow, so that's a Mahayana practice, which is actually quite advanced. It's usually something that monastics will do, and even then only some. So I actually don't particularly recommend it, except for short periods of time. It can be okay. I've personally done it for short periods, but not for long periods. But definitely doing meditation and chanting at the different holy sites you go to, it's a really good thing to do. And as for attaining jhanas during pilgrimage, I wouldn't count on it happening. In fact, I think that's quite unlikely. Jhana is something that tends to happen when one is in very peaceful, quiet settings for long periods of time, such as during very long meditation retreats, or when staying in a monastery for several months or longer, then jhana sometimes can be possible. But I wouldn't expect it during pilgrimage. During pilgrimage, I would recommend focusing on cultivating kindness, cultivating peacefulness, serenity, tranquility, equanimity, cultivating constant mindfulness of body and mind. So things like that. I think that's more relevant.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. And Daniel asks, can you please explain the meaning of anuddha, especially as found in the Siddhaka Sutta?
I'd have to see the context. Yeah, it doesn't look like a familiar word.
We'll have to get back to you.
Yeah. Daniel, send an email with this exact question, and I'll dig it up and have a look.
Okay. And Talminda says, what is the most skillful way of reacting to joy when one sees it arise in the mind, since one doesn't want to attach to it nor swat it away? About that, you want to answer this?
Okay. I suppose, though, I would ask a counter question here, which is what kind of joy is arising in the mind? If it's joy in meditation, or if it's a kind of joy like an excitement for instance, sensual pleasures. So there's a little bit of a difference in what the context of the joy is. So that would be helpful. Maybe if you send a follow-up question, I can maybe just say a couple words briefly about not wanting to get attached or swat away the joy. So maybe you're just experiencing a pleasant sensation in the mind, let's say from something wholesome. Oh, a skillful, okay, something wholesome. Then I would say you just, as in the Satipatthana Sutta, for instance, when the Buddha talks about experiencing feelings, he says when one feels a pleasant feeling, they know I'm feeling a pleasant feeling. And he basically gives the instruction that we should be aware of feelings as they arise and as they endure and then as they fall away. And we develop an awareness of this process. And as Soma was describing earlier about bodily feelings, this process is impersonal. So there are certain causes and conditions that give rise to certain types of experiences of, for instance, joy, an emotional reaction, or a bodily feeling. And so there can be different causes and conditions that give rise to this, but it's not something that we control. It's not something that I can say, oh, my feeling will be like this, and I have complete control over that. So I would say to start to develop an awareness, and it's something that's going to take time. So for instance, if this is joy in meditation, it's going to be a process of familiarizing yourself with how does this joy arise? How is it experienced? How can I work with it to further cultivate stillness, calm, tranquility, clarity? So working with the feeling, but developing an awareness around it. If it's something like joy that's just happening in a worldly sense, so you're getting excited, you're getting elated, you're being happy when you do something, for instance, you follow the precepts, then I would say to just recognize that, to be mindful of it, to be aware that the joy is arising because of something wholesome. But I wouldn't torture yourself about, oh, I shouldn't get attached to it, but I shouldn't swat it away, but should I do this or that? I would just be aware that the joy is arising and work with it from there. But maybe if you have a counter or a follow-up, then we can answer more detail.
Okay, thank you. And Rupal says, in Buddhism, how are destiny and fate explained? And how are they differentiated? Differentiated, I mean, to me, destiny and fate, not faith, but fate, seem like synonyms, right? Is that correct? Or am I missing something? Destiny, fate?
More or less.
More or less. So I'm not sure about the differentiated, but I will say a few words that come to mind in terms of how they can be explained in Buddhism. And so actually in Buddhism, we have some really good news, which is actually that to a certain degree, there is like no destiny or no faith specific, but rather we can actually make karma that creates an intentional action that creates a result. So if we don't like our current predicament, it's not that we're like, oh my God, have to, this is it. I'm destined, to even to be a human. You know what I mean? Like I'm destined to have this sort of experience. I'm destined even to have a body. No, it's not true, actually. But we can change the experience that we're having by making intentional karma and intentional action that will have then a specific result, right? So this is the good news. This being said, we actually see in the suttas how the Buddha, for example, might speak in terms of, well, either he knows where someone is going, for example, in the afterlife, right? So someone passes away and he's like, okay, this person is stream enter, this person is a non-returner, this person went to this type of heaven, this person actually went to a hell realm, this person, there's that kind of knowledge that absolutely is, once again, the knowledge, the understanding of the results of the karma, of the actions that the person has done, which create this result of rebirth, right? But there's also maybe some kind of gist of what that person will be doing. For example, the Buddha says he meets actually Bhatta, for example, and he's like, oh, this little boy, and we see in the Tiragata, he's a 7-year-old boy, and the Buddha turns to Ananda and says, this was going to be a thoroughbred, like this is destined for awakening. And in fact, the kid attains awakening shortly thereafter. And so you can say, to a certain degree, maybe you can say that the fate or the destiny that this child was so. But this is not in contradiction with what I was saying earlier, but rather it's actually an affirmation of that. And usually, sometimes we are very confused as unenlightened beings of certain things that happen to us, and we're kind of like, oh, why is this the case, or what horrible like sort of destiny, and the other person has this really good destiny kind of thing, and we can think in those terms. But when we start actually understanding the law of karma as an actual law, as something impersonal that is really cause and consequence, then we can take the agency and not worry too much about what consequences we have right now, but rather make those intentions. And those create, obviously, those certain streams, right? So for example, if one starts smoking, well, it's not that their destiny is to have lung cancer, but there's a clear, like tendency that probably that might happen, right, in the future. Or if someone starts, running every day, well, it's not that their destiny necessarily is to have a muscular body, but most likely that is, probably the effect that is going to happen, as opposed to if someone just stays on the couch all the time, right? We can predict that most likely they won't have really sculpted muscles. So we can start understanding in those ways what we generally say, or we can call destiny, or like sort of a future predicament, right? Also, the majority, I will say, of non-Buddhist practitioners tend to actually to put less effort in making particular actions that are different, right? So actually, I remember being in high school when I was an adolescent, and I was like, wow, yeah, I mean, I can totally predict, like what this person is going to be like in 20 years. And in fact, now I see that I was right. So it's not that Ayasoma, when she was an adolescent, had particular psychic powers, but it's just that the people there were, kind of not questioning too much. Some of them, obviously not everyone, but some of the folks weren't questioning too much their choices, not questioning too much their environment. Hence, it was very easy to predict, sort of, quote unquote, their destiny. And actually, it was this reflection that empowered me to actually be a little bit more, to question a little bit more of the things, because I was just more like, I don't know what I want, but I definitely don't want that in the future. I want something else. I actually wanted to be a Buddhist monk, so I found that. Took me a while, but I did find it, precisely because I didn't settle. So this is a few words of that come to mind. And hello to Norma, Maria, Edward. Sud says, what is the significance of Jayamangala Gata? Do you think this is a type of Buddhanussati?
So I assume you're referring to the Atta Jayamangala Gata, so the verses of the 8 victories of the Buddha. And this is an apocryphal text, so it was composed sometime hundreds of years after the Buddha. But it's commemorating 8 specific incidents during the life of the Buddha, and it's actually kind of a peculiar list. Like a few of them are actually really remarkable things. Like the first one is the Buddha's attainment of awakening, but then there's other ones which are kind of less significant, like the Buddha winning a debate with someone, and it's kind of like not really sure why that one was included in a list. But as a general recollection of part of the greatness of the Buddha and a few of the specific great events in the Buddha's life, I think it's actually great. It's actually a really good thing. So yeah, I would say that would be a form of Buddhanussati. It's one way of recollecting some of the great qualities of the Buddha and some of the ways that manifested during the course of his life. So yeah.
Super, thank you. And Talmid actually gives a follow-up to the question. I think I'm more thinking of sensual pleasures, even relatively wholesome ones, like a sunny day with a cool breeze.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think what I said still stands. I mean, it stands generally. What I said is before is we develop mindfulness of, this is a good practice no matter what the emotion may be. So developing mindfulness of what is arising in the mind and also in the body. And if you add to that, what are the conditions for this to arise? So one thing is to be mindful. So for instance, so I'm mindful, it's a sunny day and you're feeling lots of joy and you're like, oh, there's lots of joy. And you start to develop an awareness, a reflective awareness, which we call mindfulness of that feeling. That's one thing. You can also have a reflective awareness while you're murdering your mother, for instance. So it's not particularly useful, but it's one thing to start developing an awareness. And then you can start developing, okay, why is this joy arising? So then you see, okay, it's a very sunny day and it elates my mind. It makes my mind uplifted. I have a joyful, pleasant mental feeling that arises because of these conditions. And so that's a type of awareness and mindfulness that's going to be helpful because you're going to be able to see, one, the impersonality of this process. So, okay, when this happens, my mind feels like this. And you're also going to see the kind of general state of your mind. So your mind is delighting in certain types of sensual experiences. And so that tells you a little bit about what your mind finds important, what it finds interest in, what it delights in. And this can also inform, for instance, your meditation practice or your general cultivation of the mind. So it's very important to understand what is obscuring your mind from being settled, peaceful, still. What is making it interested in external phenomena. So this is going to be helpful in that practice. But generally, I would there's nothing wrong with feeling joyful when you see a sunset or something. But if your mind is getting extremely joyful and excited when you see chocolate cake, and you're trying to develop some more detachment from sensual desire, sensual interest, and you want to develop more inner cultivation away from sensual pleasures, if that's a practice that you're taking on, I would say it's going to be very important to understand that your mind is being elated at that. And so then you can turn the mind away from those features that it is finding elating, that it's finding arousing and attractive. So if your mind is elated at a sensual pleasure and you're trying to control that, okay, oh, my mind is becoming elated. Don't just get enthralled into the joy. Oh, it's because of these features that when I focus on them, this increases. And when I focus on these things, my mind becomes more peaceful. So this is a process that the Buddha calls applying the mind in a skillful or a way that goes to the source. And so you start to understand, oh, this feeling is arising because of this, and this one is decreasing because of that. So I would focus on, it really depends on your goal. If you're really not particularly interested in sense restraint and things like that, and you really just want to follow the precepts and be a little bit happier, then you don't need to take on this practice. I wouldn't burden yourself. But if you are interested in taking on that practice, then it will start to shape your life, and it will start to, this awareness of the feelings will become very important.
Okay, thank you. And Rick asks, does the Buddha offer guidance for being at peace when being misunderstood and misrepresented? This has been a focus of my practice in recent years. Oh, what a good question. Thank you, Rick, for bringing that up. Well, I would say the whole practice of Dhamma is just a guidance for being at peace. I actually love, in this case, instead of quoting the Buddha, I'll quote Ajahn Pasano, who's a really impressive practitioner. But yeah, I really like his, it was really helpful for me, his definition of patience, of just rather than endurance to lower our expectations. And I think this is actually really something that we can apply when we are in a sort of communication with others. So we always have the expectation that even simply because we're using the same language, that we're being completely understood, or even more so, if we're the same culture. But the reality is that we're constantly actually being misunderstood, and we're constantly misunderstanding others. And we're constantly misrepresenting reality, and we're constantly misrepresenting people, and we're constantly being misrepresented, right? So it's just that's the process essentially of moha. It's the process of delusion. I remember when I was an adolescent, today I have a lot of adolescence stories. One of my favorite books, actually one of my favorite authors was Milan Kundera, and all his books are basically exactly on this topic of misunderstanding and misrepresentation. And they're actually very fascinating because I remember I would start reading the book, and it was a story, and I would side with the protagonist. And then the second story would be, I would side with the protagonist, and then the third story I would side with the protagonist, and then at the end of the book I would realize that actually, like, the three people were all like the same, like they were part of the same story. It's just that the story was told first with the perspective of one person, say the father, then the second story was told with the perspective of the mother, and then the third story was told by the perspective of the daughter, for example. And so whenever you see things through the perspective, through the lenses of the person that is having the experience, you tend to side with them because you understand, right? It's not misrepresented. But when you're on the other side, you'll see it based on your lived experience, based, you can say, on your past karma. So it's your vipaka. So you will be a little bit confused. So when we stop taking it personally, right, we stop thinking that this is, something that other people are doing to us, and we actually start seeing the impersonal nature of all things. And then we go, okay, well, it's a little bit as if I get angry that, there's the law of gravity and that things are falling from the sky rather than going up the sky by themselves, right? We don't get upset when we see, when rain, for example, starts falling like that, right? We understand that is just the nature of it. But if we take it personally, then of course we're upset. And so it's the same thing with whenever we're interacting with others. When we kind of understand that we are deluded, we understand how we are doing it as well, and how our perception is a little bit off, then we become a little less surprised when this happens. When we're on the receiving end. And a little bit more forgiving too. And maybe then, once again, getting back to Ajampasanno's expectations, then we can be surprised when actually people really understand us and don't misrepresent us. And we're like, oh, wow, it's amazing. Well, actually, you told it even better than I, you're explaining what I wanted to say even better. Like, oh, incredible, how wonderful. So in that way, life becomes a little bit more easy to bear. And Shadow Label asks, how should one know when they need to fight versus when they should meditate to eliminate the fight in their mind with nothingness to prevent the fight? An example when fight or flight is needed. This is a tongue twist. How do you say? Tongue twister? Okay.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by with nothingness, but the rest of your question is relatively clear as far as I can tell. I mean, assuming I'm not misunderstanding you. Generally speaking, from a Buddhist perspective, you don't need to fight ever. And fighting is almost always going to be, in terms of physical combat anyway, fighting is almost always going to be an unwholesome decision. And we should always be looking for non-violent solutions. But if by fighting you mean resisting something, well, whether resisting verbally or resisting in again, not in a physical violent way, but just resisting something, well, the question is, why are you resisting it? Is it just because you don't like it, or is it because you actually genuinely think it's harmful and unwholesome? So this is where it's actually good to reflect on our motivations. Well, it's like, well, why? Why are we resistant to what's going on? Do we actually think that this is something which is genuinely bad and harmful and unwholesome and evil? And if so, then how can we resist it in a way which is maintaining our own purity of mind, maintaining our own peacefulness and gentleness, while also trying to improve the situation. So I would actually say that even in a situation where one feels the need to fight or to resist, then one should be doing so still in a meditative way, in a contemplative way, in a way which is peaceful and kind and wise. So those are my thoughts on the matter anyway.
Thank you, Bante, and good to see you, Sudha. And Rupa actually says, with fate as an example, someone that gets into an accident and dies, how is that explained? So I would say that actually in this case, we should really remember, actually, I think it's Migala, the householder Migala, that goes on to speculation of some sort of someone's destination after life, or what they've done and so forth. And the Buddha turns around towards Migala and goes, stop doing that, you fool. Only me or someone like me can actually really understand, like have a say in really what is the reason, what are the conditions that created this result, and what will happen afterwards. So I feel like we should actually take that at heart and stop speculating, and instead actually focusing more on what can we do right now? What kind of seeds do we want to plant? And that's a little bit more skillful. Otherwise, we can waste our entire life speculating on what is happening to us and what is happening to others and what is happening and why and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And then actually just keep on making evil deeds that actually create really bad consequences, or just not taking the time or the energy to really uproot the kilesas, so all the defilements from the mind. So I would say that we can find better ways to occupy our time with. And Hayang says, is Vasa only for Theravada and Sangha, but not for Mahayana and Tibetan traditions? Different countries have different weathers for the Vasa months. Does this defeat the objectives of Vasa? Can monks leave the temple for a short period during the Vasa? And what are the terms and conditions allowing them to do so? Do they obtain permission from their seniors or the Buddha through chanting or special prayers? Wow, you want the whole Khandaka. So, Venerable Banda.
Okay. So is Vasa only for Theravada and Sangha, but not for Mahayana and Tibetan traditions? The Mahayana and Tibetan traditions also have Vinyas. So usually Mahayana, East Asian Mahayana, they have the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya. It's a school of Vinaya, which is actually very close to the Pali Vinaya that the Theravadins have. And the Tibetans have something called a Mulasarvastivada. So these are just different recensions, essentially, of the same rules. So they do have access to this concept of the Vasa, but they might follow it in a different way. So they might relate to the Vasa differently. Some Mahayana monastics will stay in a Vasa, they will relate to the Vasa in a way very similar to people who are familiar with Theravada Buddhism. But other monastics in the Mahayana tradition, whether East Asian or Tibetan or the various Mahayana branches, they might relate to the Vasa in a different way. So they might not have a period of stability for this specific time period as is familiar to the Theravada and Sangha. And this is also true of Theravada monastics as well. So usually Vasa is followed in a particular way that's quite common, but it can be related to differently. I would say it's more common for Mahayana and in Tibet and things for them to relate to the Vasa in a way that's different than is common in Theravada. But it really just depends on the monastery and the monastic. So different countries have different weathers. Yes, this is true. Yes. In India and in the area around South Asia, this is the monsoon season, and there are actually different monsoon seasons at different times, but that's not true, obviously, for the whole world. So usually the way that this is related to is that the Vasa is followed as it was in the time and place of India, northern India. So there's a little bit of flexibility in when exactly the monsoon season is and when someone can take Vasa. So this is kind of getting into the details of the monastic rules. But there are different time periods when it can be followed. But usually this is related to, in terms of, for instance, in Empty Cloud, we're in Vasa right now because this is the month when the rainy season, the monsoon season is roughly in India. So it's not the rainy season here, but we do follow the Vasa in that time. Sometimes monasteries will shift the Vasa, but in Theravada, the Theravadan tradition, this seems to be quite rare as of now. So not very common, quite rare. But sometimes monasteries will have a period that's very similar to Vasa, like a winter retreat. And they might do that because in the winter, it's almost like the equivalent, right? It's harder to travel, it's very cold, it's easy to be inside and stable. So there might be something like a winter retreat, and that can also happen in Mahayana, East Asian Mahayana, Tibet. So it really just depends again. Does this defeat the objective of Vasa? Yes and no. So the objective of Vasa originally was directly related to the weather in one sense, because it was inconvenient to travel. It was a time when traveling was seen as less of an ideal thing to be doing. But the objective of Vasa is not just the weather. It's also, there are other reasons. So it's also cultural, which, in the time of the Buddha, it was other groups also had periods of stability. And again, this is partially related to the weather, but also there's a little bit of wisdom in that the Buddha saw. So he obviously saw that this practice was something that was worth advising for his community. So if it was just related to the weather and there was no other reason, then it's not necessarily the case that he would say, okay, we should do it just because of the weather. But there's benefits that the Buddha gives, for instance, for being in a stable environment. And in the Vinaya and in the suttas, we see how the monastics, they have a pattern of, they might go into a community for Vasa and they spend time there and they get to know that community, and then they travel. So there are certain patterns of behavior, certain dynamics that this establishes in the community. And all of that is still relevant today. So people still they establish and determine Vasa, they spend time, they maybe make determinations for practice and study, and they get to know a community. So there's still other benefits to Vasa. It's not just the weather. But of course, originally that was a factor. Can monks leave the temple for a short period during the Vasa? So long story short, yes. A fully ordained person can leave the monastery for 7 days, 6 nights. That's the standard. But again, this, depending on how someone's holding the rules and how they're relating to the Vasa, this can be different. But this is quite common in Theravadan tradition, 6 nights away from where you've determined Vasa. Do they obtain permission from their seniors or the Buddha through chanting or special prayers? So we don't usually get permission from the Buddha through special prayers. Some would say it's not possible. Some might say it is possible, but usually the way that this is done is if someone wants to leave, they have a reason. So maybe to take care of their parents, or there's an emergency, or they need to go for some reason that's related to the Dhamma or their family, or it's related to something that's beneficial to themselves or others, for a good reason. And so they'll tell the community, they'll get permission from their seniors, yes, they'll get permission from the people that they're going to visit, ideally. And so there's kind of an arrangement, there's an arrangement set up where, yes, there's permission, but it's not through the Buddha. The Buddha does not give permission for Sangha procedures anymore.
Excellent. Thank you, Venerable. Very good. Brian says, how do we know in life when to be persistent and keep trying in the face of failure versus when to accept failure, let go, and move on to something new? Okay.
Well, I mean, ultimately, we always need to evaluate things in terms of what is wholesome and what is unwholesome, in the sense of what is beneficial and what is harmful. So beneficial to ourselves and to others, and also what is, in particular, what is supportive to cultivating the factors of awakening. Again, it really depends upon what it is that you're trying to do, and it also depends upon whether it's worth putting forth the effort to keep trying to do it. So if it's just like an ordinary worldly pursuit that has nothing whatsoever to do with spiritual practice, well, then it's probably not really that significant whether you keep trying or whether you let go and move on. And in that case, you just need to ask yourself, if I do keep trying, can I keep trying in a way which is relaxed, unattached, which is not cultivating defilements in myself? and if I'm going to let go and move on instead, can I do so in a way without regret, without beating myself up over it? So it's always saying, how can I do this with a peaceful mind, a calm mind, a gentle mind, a loving mind, in a way which is supportive to equanimity and non-attachment. But when it's something genuinely wholesome, like for example, if you're talking about meditation practice and you're like, well, I keep failing, well, maybe I should just let go of meditation practice and move on. Then the answer is no, you should keep persisting, because that's an extremely wholesome activity, which will bring very positive spiritual results. So it really depends upon what exactly it is that you're deciding whether to persist in or give up on, and also how it affects your mind in either case. So those are my thoughts on the matter.
Excellent. Thank you, Bante. And Wiseman says, I have great difficulties following my breath when I meditate due to chronic anxiety, which manifests physically, causing my breath to be more rapid and uncomfortable. Any strategies to further calm the mind when I'm in this state of more heightened anxiety? Yes, I would say actually stop practicing mindfulness of breathing. So, so we want to be practical. And I think the Buddha actually was very practical, which is why he actually gave us many different meditation ways of practicing meditation, essentially ways of cultivating the mind. Actually, I like that word better than meditation. Oh, here is well, one thing that you can do is actually foster a cat. That will like make you a lot less. See, here is Teddy the monastic cat. Very good for treating anxiety or any other ailments. It will sit on you, and then you can meditate actually on the pleasant feeling that there comes by having a cat on your lap. But jokes, actually, I'm like kind of serious. But aside from that, yeah, just try some other sort of ways of cultivating the mind. For example, metta meditation actually is a great way of really creating a mind that you want to dwell in, rather than a place that can be a little bit averse to be in, right? So metta is one of the 4 Brahma Viharas. So what is Brahma Vihara? It's a divine abode. So yeah, that's definitely sounds like a place where we all want to kind of hang out, right? It's not like, an infernal abode or like a really agitating abode, but rather it's it's a divine abiding. We want to a divine abode. We want to actually really looking forward to going there. So then we can introduce actively images, for example, of a sweet cat that is here purring, or we can actually bring thoughts of wishing, love towards our parents, if we have a good relationship with them, hopefully, of people that we love, or animals that we love. It doesn't matter exactly the subject, but we can actually bring up usually the image, and then kind of drop the image and stay with the feeling, and by feeling I mean like the emotion, the sentiment, that really that love without attachments, that love without I love you, but or may you be happy in those circumstances. Like we want to remove all of that and stay with may you be happy or I love you, and just cultivate that and make the mind a happy place. And also joy. Yeah, actively producing joy in the mind, cultivating joy in the mind. Also cultivating compassion in the mind. And then obviously a little bit harder, equanimity. So this, this understanding of how things are, seeing things closely, and being equanimous towards all things. And so in that way, we actually have a nice place and a nice mind where to dwell in, where then it's harder for anxiety to, come in and destroy everything. And then once, we've mastered actually the Brahmaviharas, I think you can give then mindfulness of breathing another shot because the mind will have been primed to stay in a sort of different dynamic. You give the mind a different place where to dwell for a while, and so then perhaps it will be a little bit different the way that then that mind will approach looking at the breath. Another thing that I found very helpful with the instructions of the Buddha is actually to just pay attention to the element of tranquility, which is very different from doing mindfulness of breathing in per se, but rather just looking, maybe scanning the entire body from the top of the head to the tip of the toes, looking, seeking, like where is a place in the body where I can find tranquility, even in the sort of the state of the most agitation, where we think it's impossible, there's no place that is tranquil. Well, actually, yeah, you can, even look at the hair, for example, here on the arm. Well, the hair is pretty calm. It's pretty tranquil. And actually looking at it and feeling it and embracing it, and then holding that in the mind as the element of tranquility. And we see that actually also calms the mind, and anxiety, once again, doesn't have a foothold. So these are a few thoughts. And hello, Scott. Can the Venables please reflect on success with thoughts of harm? I can't remember who spoke last.
I think Bante is up. I'm not sure.
Bante?
Well, I don't understand the question. So, Scott, if you could rephrase your question, because I just don't understand what you're asking.
Okay. Then maybe you want to take this one. Sud asks, for some reason, I can't help but feel divine grace whenever I think of the 8 victories in the Jayavagalagatha. I love it too, I have to say. It's so wonderful. As if everything is going to be okay and there is immense peace. Should one explore this and see if jhana can be entered through these means?
So, I mean, if you're focusing on that sense of joy and peace to the point where the mind becomes completely unified in a joyful, peaceful state, then yes, I would say yes. So yeah, I would say that Buddhanusati can be a starting point in progressing towards jhana, can be a starting point in cultivating samadhi. So it's not...
Sorry, we're having a cat problem, cat moving.
Yeah, so it's not a method which I've historically used myself, but I know other monks who have had success with using Buddhanusati as their starting point. So I think, yeah, if it works for you, then explore it. Try focusing on that joy and sense of peace that comes up when you think about the Buddha.
Excellent. Thank you, Bante. And Rick says, I have been taking steps toward letting go of possessions and living a simple life. Can you offer guidance on the benefits and possible pitfalls of living a simple minimalist lifestyle?
Yes. Okay. Congratulations. And I think, Rick, that you've been doing this for quite some time, if I remember correctly, because I remember you making comments like this before. So, yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's best to look at the pitfalls first, actually, because there's lots of benefits to living a simple minimalist lifestyle. And I think that you'll see that, and you probably have seen that already. I can only assume that if you're making this decision, that oh wow, there's more peace to be found here. So there are many benefits, but I think it's good to look at the pitfalls so that we don't fall into them, because there doesn't have to be a drawback to having a simple minimalist lifestyle. So I'd say that that's something to keep in mind here, that if you are feeling that you're having bad side effects, unwanted side effects from living a more simple, peaceful, wholesome lifestyle, then I would discriminate. Are those side effects external or internal? So if the side effects are internal, like you're feeling a sense of dissatisfaction, you're not feeling very peaceful anymore, you're not feeling at ease, you're feeling a lot of desire, unwholesome qualities are increasing and the wholesome qualities are decreasing, then I would reevaluate how you're relating to that and the types of decisions you're making and why that's going on. If it's external, like you're living a more simple lifestyle and the people around you find it really annoying that you don't want to watch TV with them, you can't go to movies anymore, you don't listen to music. Why would you not listen to music? How could you get rid of music? It's the most wonderful thing to happen to humanity. And you're feeling that there's a lot of conflict going on around the simplicity, then I would say it's probably a time when we can reflect on, not to associate with fools. the first line of advice that the Buddha gives in the Magna Sutta. So he says, "Asevana badanam." So not to associate with fools. So if you find that there's a pitfall, and this is a real pitfall that many people experience. So they start to simplify their life, and people around them aren't so happy about them doing that. They're not so happy about the decisions that other people are making. And it can be minor and it can also be very serious. So it can cause family issues, it can cause marriage issues, it can cause really serious issues. So if someone is, if the decisions that they're making are, if you're in a relationship and these decisions affect that relationship poorly, then you have to consider the other person. If it's your own thing, I would say that look at how you're relating to other people and try to find a balance. So try not to make it more difficult for yourself and others. But it can also be okay to just say, you know what, this is my decision and I don't need to accommodate. I don't need to listen to music because someone else says I'm lame, right? Or because someone else says, oh, why would you do that? We don't need to argue with people. We can just say, oh, that's great that you have that you get so much joy from music. And it's great that I get so much peace. So I'm just picking music because it's a common example of something people give up, right? But as for the benefits, I would say that the benefits is that this is what the Buddha points to for how to have successful meditation. This is what the Buddha points to for how to have a happy life here, how to have a happy life later, how to transcend the need to have happiness in later lives, for instance, too. So the Buddha says that by cultivating virtue, by cultivating simplicity, by cultivating contentment, by cultivating restraint, that we give rise to non-regret, we give rise to joy, we give rise to peace, tranquility. And what happens when we don't regret things, when we're content and peaceful? Well, the mind starts to settle down. The body starts to become calm. The mind then becomes elated. Oh, this is very nice. This is very peaceful. And the mind can enter samadhi. So then you can enter, people have talked about jhana here. You can enter jhana eventually, right? You're laying the groundwork for jhana. You're also laying the groundwork for cultivation of the mind when you're not sitting down in formal meditation, which is almost probably more of the time that you're spending, right? Especially as a lay person, if you have to work or you have to sustain yourself, then living a simple life is going to make it, your normal state of mind is going to become more simple. It's going to reflect the external conditions around you. So usually our mind echoes everything that goes on around us. It starts repeating, it starts bringing all these things up. So if you live a very simple life, a very grounded life, then you're going to feel the effects of that externally reflecting internally on you. And it's really good to reflect on those benefits because otherwise you start to get caught up, right? Okay, I live a very simple life, but eventually you get used to it and it's not so special anymore. And it starts to be a little bit difficult. And it's kind of like, well, what's the point of this anyway? Why don't I just enjoy sensuality, right? Why am I even living so simply and torturing myself? In fact, what's the point of Buddhism at all? Right? Maybe this type of question arises. So, if you're finding that that's the reaction you're having, I would say maybe you should evaluate why you want to do that and reflect on the benefits that it brings you. So really try to get the best out of this. The Buddha is very clear that he says, lay people, you do things, you make merit, you give to the Sangha, you follow the precepts, and you don't have the benefits from living a full monastic lifestyle. But still, from time to time, you should enter in the joy and the bliss of seclusion. And what he's basically saying by that is that you should recollect all these wholesome qualities that you're growing. Your mind is like a garden and you made it so fertile. You're living a life and it's so fertile. And so you should benefit from that and just remind yourself of it and relate your mind and really dwell. Like I was speaking earlier about the Brahma Viharas, this divine fighting. So you can dwell in that. And if you can bring that from sitting to walking to standing to lying down, and you can start to dwell in the peace, dwell in the serenity, remind yourself of the benefits, bring them up, cultivate them, make much of them, then you're going to get a lot of really good results of living a simple life. If you instead focus on, oh, I don't have any access to sensual pleasures, my life is so boring, then you're not going to have that, right? You're going to have regret. You're going to have the opposite of the qualities that we're supposed to be cultivating. So I would say really make the most of the external, because if you live a simple life externally, but your mind's a mess, it's not going to do much. It's a starting point. It's a condition that can give rise to other conditions if it's appropriately related to. So that's what I would, a couple reflections on this.
Excellent. Thank you, Venerable. And Gerson asks, I would like to know what Buddhism says, if it says. How would I tackle fear in my mind? Very good question. Well. Depends on what kind of fear, but in general, actually, if it's just perhaps fear of being in a particular place or just, kind of like a more general fear. I would say recollecting the qualities of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. That's actually also something that we see in the suttas, and also that has been done also by really incredible masters of the recent past. So actually, we see it in the biographies. For example, of Ajahn Chah, he would put himself intentionally in situations of extreme fear. Going to Dong, for example, wandering in the middle of the forest, and then sleeping at night, and there'll be actually like a tiger right next to his sleeping grounds, or all sorts of kind of crazy scenarios, and he would be terrified, literally terrified. And he speaks about his terror and he also speaks about overcoming his terror, and he basically overcomes it in two ways. One, by essentially bringing to mind the fact that maybe he has done something wrong in the past, in previous lives, to that tiger, for example. And going, okay, well, if I've done something wrong to you in the past, tiger, and now you're getting back to me, well, I completely understand. Like, I'll just accept it. And the other way was, once again, to recollect the qualities of the Buddha in his mind, and over again, and having faith in the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, and actually getting this to uplift oneself. The other thing is also to just cultivate sila. So cultivating actually, purity of mind, purity of actions. So then we're also not afraid of the consequences of our actions. Right? So that can be like one of the biggest, even obstacles in meditation. Whenever we do something that is not really that great, then it will come back haunting us, and it will be cause of lots of agitation and fear. So if we just don't do that, then there's nothing to fear. There's nothing. We're kind of like at peace. And we're also at peace in terms of like, where are we going to go, quote unquote, afterwards, right? When this body will stop working, and then kind of like, well, I think I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay, like in this life, and I'm okay also for future lives. So we can start reducing as much as possible any type of source of fear in the mind. And cultivating faith in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha is actually a potent way of eradicating this at the core, because that means that then also by faith we develop these qualities of enlightenment, these qualities that bring us towards the cessation of suffering. And what is fear? It's a form of suffering. So the more we become aligned to the Buddha, we become aligned to the Dhamma, we become aligned to the Sangha, then the more, the suffering starts fading away. Okay, and there is Scott that says, at times thoughts of harm arise in the mind. It is horrible and sickening. How can we approach these phenomena in a kind and peaceful way? How can we abandon them for good? Okay.
Well, I mean, first off, it's important to recognize that much of what appears in the mind is not things that we are intentionally doing, but rather it's echoes of things that we've heard or seen in the past, or echoes of old habits of mind coming up again. So particularly the fact that you don't want these thoughts to be present is an indication that you don't approve of them, that you recognize these thoughts as unwholesome. And that indicates that odds are you're not doing much to actively produce them. So that's already a good sign. And also the fact that you identify them as unwholesome and undesirable is also quite good, because it indicates that your conscience is functioning. So when those thoughts appear in the mind, rather than respond with horror and disgust, and instead we just recognize, oh, this is not me. This is just the product of past conditioning, past experiences. And it's something which I'm going to refrain from strengthening, refrain from participating in. And then the thought will just come and go, and it won't affect you. So in this way, you can keep a peaceful mind. And also being kind to yourself. And it's like, oh, well, it's natural. As an unawakened person, it's natural that unwholesome thoughts will sometimes appear in the mind. That's what happens to unawakened people. So we can also be kind and tolerant towards ourselves. Like, oh, poor little buddy, having these disturbing thoughts appear in the mind. It's a little bit awkward and uncomfortable. Oh, little buddy, it's okay. And so having some compassion for yourself that you are experiencing these disturbing thoughts, but recognizing that those thoughts they're just part of the weather patterns of samsara, and it's not personal. It's just something which will sometimes drift through the mind, just like a dark cloud drifting through the sky. So when those thoughts come and go, just let them come and go without getting on board, without participating in those thoughts. And also without taking them personally, just recognizing that this is just the product of past conditions. And as for how to let them go entirely, how to prevent them from arising entirely, one does that through actively cultivating metta. By doing a lot of metta meditation, then the tendency to have thoughts of harming will diminish and eventually disappear.
Thank you, Bhante. And good to see you, Bhante Kusala. Hello, Venerable. It says, Kalena Dhamma Saka Cha Etam Mangalam Uttamam. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And Spook Waters asks, why aren't the virtues talked about more, as you just did, because of the Western translation of the Four Noble Truths?
I don't understand.
Well, I think that the virtues sometimes are not talked about that much, perhaps. This is an hypothesis. In Western Circle, I assume that's Spook Waters is talking about. Yeah, why is Sila kind of overlooked? I would say that generally, maybe, is also because a lot of the folks maybe went to study with the masters, perhaps back in the day in Thailand, and they were offered, the teachings that kind of also the perhaps Thai people or Burmese people were getting, and maybe they were emphasizing a little bit more meditation, the practice of cultivating the mind, more samadhi, and so forth. But that's just because usually the average person in a Buddhist country will be very knowledgeable about Sila and Dana, right? Because they are born in a Buddhist culture, so it's kind of like everybody knows about it. So it's just like going to a Catholic church in Italy. Usually the people there will emphasize other aspects of the path, of the Catholic path, that are not exactly, they won't be spelling out certain things, right? They won't be spelling out the commandments because everybody knows the commandments, right? They won't be spelling out certain things. They kind of take them for granted. So maybe perhaps that's why sometimes certain other aspects of the path are emphasized, and then people maybe took those teachings and started sharing them without keeping in mind the fact that maybe sila was a huge important part of it that was a little bit overlooked. So maybe that's a possible idea. I don't know about the Western translation of the Four Noble Truths, what you're referring to. I don't know about that, you have.
Yeah, I don't know, because in the Fourth Noble Truth, it would include the Noble Eightfold Path, which is mostly sila.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I could think of is the emphasis in the West. Sometimes there's an emphasis on the Four Noble Truths as kind of, you jump right away to, okay, here's suffering, and then the path out of suffering, and it's kind of meditation, right? Meditation technique. So do this meditation technique, and so sometimes maybe the way that the Four Noble Truths are presented in the West is incomplete. As Bhante pointed out, though, actually, that they include the whole path of practice, which is not just meditation. But sometimes there is that emphasis, so maybe that could be part of it. The way the presentation that Sayaz was saying is conditioned by the past as well.
Actually, this is a very good point. Maybe the emphasis on meditation. So, for example, then the sila, as the Venerables have mentioned, usually is thought about it as included within, say, a meditation retreat. So in a meditation retreat, if you go to any kind of meditation center, by default, you're practicing all the silas, right? So in most meditation centers, maybe it's not emphasized after you leave the meditation retreat center. And so perhaps, there's a bit of a difference between intentionally taking up some precepts and working with them outside of a meditation retreat context, and actually taking those precepts and practicing them, kind of like not eating after noon. Well, if there's no food offered during the meditation retreat afternoon, you're kind of like by default, like practicing that. So it's the kind of the same thing. So if you're also like in a soundproof, like place, like you just won't be like maybe you won't even be seeing any kind of insects, so you won't be actually killing them. I don't know, like there's protected. I can't speak anymore. Anyway, you got the gist. Anything else that you want to say about the?
I think that's good.
All right. Shadow of Label is asking, do you guys get vacations from religion from time to time? I hope not. That would be meaning disrobing. So
sometimes we do.
We do? I hope
organized
not.
Religion. Vacations from organized religion.
I don't think she means it in that perspective. No, we don't. We don't take any breaks from being monastics. So.
Okay. So I think looks like that's it for this evening.
Yes, that's all for tonight. Thank you for tuning in and asking your questions. And good to see you, Mary. Awesome. So we can all end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.